Well, thanks for staying for the very last session, which we hope will be a much more discussion-focused. I know you've had a lot of PowerPoint thrown at you today, so the idea is that this will be a conversation. And it's a really important conversation about how the media engages with the biodiversity crisis. So I'm going to go with the assumption first, and hopefully all of my guests agree, that no organization is covering the biodiversity crisis to the extent that they should be. And that's not to say that there aren't organizations that aren't covering it. I think lots of organizations are trying in their own ways. But of course, we all know that the scale of the crisis is so big that it needs much more coverage along the line of COVID or other emergencies that we've faced in the past. So I'm thrilled personally to get to chair this session because it's a really important issue that's near and dear to my heart. And in my own efforts to deal with this passion, I have a show on News Talk called Down to Earth where I try and communicate issues like biodiversity better. And I'm even more thrilled that the organizers let me have a say in the guests joining us today, and they're all guests that I felt really strongly are true leaders in the environmental communications area. So we're joined by Marcus Stewart, who has been executive producer of EcoEye for the last 17 years. I think you've framed the biodiversity emergency in a million different ways at this stage. Professor Jane Stout, who's probably been mentioned more than any other person today in this conference, so you know her from her incredible research in biodiversity loss and drivers, but also a co-founder of the All Ireland Pollinator Plan, and a regular go-to person in the Irish media on biodiversity. And finally, Philip Boucher-Hayes, who of course you know from RTE as a presenter and also presenter of the Hot Mess podcast, which is one of my go-to sources for climate communications. And Philip, I really feel that you have mastered effective climate communications, and I think that we could learn a lot from how you communicate climate and how we might learn from that in terms of how we communicate biodiversity. So I've asked all of my guests to reflect on how we could improve media communications from their own perspectives. And Philip, maybe you could start us off in that discussion.
Philip's going to start with a song because he promised to
liven things up a little bit, folks. Wake you all up. Look, I'm going to give you a deliberately very sparse answer to that question, Cara, because I'm hoping that we can get a dialogue going here very early on in this discussion, because I come here genuinely from a position of humility. And want to hear the takes of everybody else in the room, because, let's face it, if I was doing what I'm charged with doing, if Marcus was doing what he was charged with doing properly, well then we wouldn't need to be here, because I've been making programs in this space since the early 2000s, as has Marcus, and whatever it is that we're doing just ain't working, folks, really, is it? So very, very briefly, the approach that I take, and this is the one that I would offer to you to provide your critique of and tell me what I should do differently, or if I'm absolutely perfect, as Cara tries to flatter me into believing. I don't think that putting a program on RTE1 television at 9:30 called the Biodiversity documentary ever works. I know that there are plenty of people in this room who would be delighted to see such a program, but I would suggest, again in all humility, that there would be very few other people in the general audience who would want to watch that program from beginning to end. To me, the successful way of trying to communicate these issues is not by signposting them or flagging them too overtly, but by presenting them as part of the political dialogue, or a scandal, a shock, something that people should be concerned, should be worried about. I'll give you a practical example rather than talking about this theoretically, and then I'll shut up and hand you over to Jane and Marcus. I very recently made a program that arrived at conclusions about the value of high nature value farming, without ever using the term high nature value farming, without ever signposting that that's where we were going, because the starting point was about wildfires and the increased instances of wildfires and how we're going to have to start planning more along the lines of how Mediterranean countries deal with these issues because of the impact of climate change on the Irish climate and Irish flora. similarly made a TV documentary, which if I had pitched it to RTE's commissioning editors as, and then I'm going to go and I'm going to spend a half an hour of the programme on the bogs talking about sphagnum moss, and then from there I'm going to go and I'm going to dive off the coast of Kerry and take a look at the barren underwater landscape or seascape we've seen there and talk to somebody about the carbon capturing potential of kelp, the programme would never have gotten made, and I would suggest very, very few people would ever have actually bothered themselves watching it. If approached in a roundabout way, it has been my impression that the audience are more willing to accept these things. It's a challenge to not get too far ahead of public opinion, but to continually try and challenge public opinion. But if you get too far ahead of them, you'll be seen as alarmist, and if you're an alarmist, you lose your credibility and your ability to communicate effectively. Full stop. Thank you very much, Cara.
Thank you. Well, I'll come to Marcus now, because you've done this for 17 years. You've had to, position issues like biodiversity a million different ways. Do you agree with Philip? Do you have any other things to add to how we could be doing better?
100%. I think I'd add that, it's very hard to get eyeballs, these days, getting people to engage in anything. We're overwhelmed with information, and we've got so many TV channels now, we've got so many VOD, and we got to really think, how do we get through, how do we get people to it's all very well to say, oh, I'd love to make this great documentary about how bad things are, who's going to watch it? There's so much great stuff on Netflix, and you could just, people get home. So we really have to think harder about how do we really get people sucked into the message. Some of the things I think that definitely don't work are the technical speak. We see it all the time at these conferences, and you go, are we trying to get through to the public here? Who are we trying to get through to? Even the word biodiversity, can we not just use the word nature? I know you have to use it in academia, but we have to sort of think, how do we get past the technical speak and really put this stuff in layman's terms? Because as soon as you start talking about technical way, you lose that really hard to get attention. And then certainly I think the biodiversity crisis. You can look at the big picture and you think it's bleak. Certainly with climate change, it's really bleak. But if we're always being negative, people don't want it. It's such a big crisis. It's existential, and if we get too negative about, and that's the only message, people don't want to engage with that. They want to see solutions that they can get involved with. So they're the things that we need to sort of look at, and how do we communicate them better. They're the initial things I'd add. I remember being at a biodiversity, protests, or whatever it was, and there was people there trying to make their point, and there was this slogan, it was that humans are the problem, And I remember thinking, it's such a bad way to frame anything. It's such a bad message. And there was a guy walking his kids home from school, and looking at this poster, and you're thinking, how is that going to resonate with someone? What does it mean? And it might be true in lots of respects, but you're not going to get any votes that way. So we got to think harder about how we message it, really hard. Yeah.
Jane, are humans the problem? You're a scientist. You must find this difficult, that you want to convey things in an accurate way, but then you have people like Marcus telling you need to be more positive and give us more solutions. So what do you think media could be doing better to deal with this issue?
Just listening to both of the comments previously, and there's so much that I wanted to pick up on there, but I just pick up on something that Anna Maria just said from IPBES, is that people are part of nature, and I think I agree with you completely. We can't put people and nature in a battle against each other. We need to bring the two together, and absolutely we can't go with negative messaging all the time, and I think that's one of the issues, is it can be very doom and gloom, and people will switch off, and they do switch off. And
Why
I think,
did you look at me when you said that?
because you said it a minute ago. But and this issue with the technical language, as scientists, we have a very specific definition of what biodiversity is, and we don't equate it with nature. Nature's more, to me anyway. Nature is more than just biodiversity. Biodiversity is the variety of life at the 3 different levels. So it's that. Does that turn people off? Probably. And then, I suppose there's the issue around who is communicating. I sort of laughed inside when you introduced me as a media expert. I don't feel like that at all. And I feel like we need a Greta. We need a David Attenborough. We need somebody who is our voice for nature and who does make it interesting. And sorry, not looking at you again.
Like Philip.
like Philip, yes.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. We need a Greta, because that was something when I said I was chairing this conference, someone on Twitter said, why aren't young people striking for biodiversity action, and how do we mobilize young people to engage in this issue?
But if we come back to that issue of the technicality of the language, young people and a lot of people are equating biodiversity and climate as the same thing. And so I talk to a lot of people who say, isn't it the climate crisis, isn't it terrible? And I'm like, yeah, and the biodiversity crisis. And they're, well, isn't that all the same thing? And when the Fridays for Future marches, when they happened pre-COVID, the kids, they had their banners, they were about climate change, but they were also about biodiversity loss. So maybe we're getting too technical trying to think of these as separate issues, and actually it's all part of this environmental issues.
There's something that occurs to me, just as you frame that question, just listening to the way Jane was responding. When I think most of the people at this stage were growing up, we had in the broadcasting sphere heroes, frankly, like Eamon de Butler, like Gerrit van Geldern, obviously David Attenborough, David Bellamy, making programs that were phenomenally well-resourced. I know this is going to sound like the Bail Bucht, but the budgets that myself and Marcus make programs with now would be a tenth of what was available to those people, at the amount of time, more important than cash, just the amount of time and research resources that they had. And it was telling. I cannot tell you how captivated I was as an 8 or a 9-year-old by those programs, and how much of my worldview it shaped, and how absent from my own children's broadcasting consumption habits that kind of stuff is now.
But our kids are consuming media in a completely different way. We would be on a Sunday night, Life on Earth comes on, everybody sits down and watches it. That's not what happens now.
For the 8 weeks of the year that it's on a Sunday, absolutely. But what else is in that, is occupying that space? This is my subtle way of saying, if there's anybody out here from an agency with a large checkbook in their back of their pocket, come and talk to me outside afterwards.
You have to fight Marcus for that. Marcus, how do you get the resources, or how do you sell it to be able to get the resources to produce biodiversity television?
Yeah, it's tough. The broadcasters, they need to have eyeballs. They need to have big numbers to watch, and if you want to give a good slot, you need to have big numbers. So and you're competing against other shows that are much easier to make, like cooking shows. Really easy to make, and you could churn out a half-an-hour show in a day. And people like to watch cooking shows, so it's difficult. And if you want to be outside in the wild and do wilderness photography, and it does brings the cost up. So you have that battle, and you go, who's going to meet that extra bit of funding that will make that work?
So there's a lot of people in the audience who are experts in biodiversity, and they all have great stories, and they want to get their stories into the media. What do you guys recommend that they need to do to help facilitate that?
Can I, again, all humility, present Philip Boucher-Hayes' unified theory of science communication, which can be distilled down to one very simple message that I know Jane Stout knows, certainly, and it's... actually, sorry, who am I talking to here, first of all? How many people from academia? Hands up. Okay, so this is a complete waste of time, giving you my unified... How many people from government agencies?
Yeah.
Okay, the vast majority of you. How many farmers here, apart from Michael? Okay, that's a bit of a disappointment, but we'll come back to that in a minute. Okay, the first thing is, when media call, when particularly one of those daily programs calls, answer the phone. Make space in your day for it. Yes, it is an awful arseache because they will demand that you are available to them at certain times and say certain things, and then they'll drop you at a moment's notice. But that is your opportunity to say whatever it is that is most important to you. There's several parts to this theory, so I think I might post them somewhere else at some later point
tweet it
in
out,
time.
yeah.
But folks, the most important thing is that you realize the limitations of the media that it is that you are engaging with. TV is an intellectual minnow. Yes, it would be nice if we still had Carl Sagan type programming of a Sunday evening. No, we don't, because it doesn't get eyeballs on TV. So if you are dissatisfied that a 90-second news item hasn't properly covered an issue, then you haven't really registered what the limitations of the medium are that you're getting your news or your information from. Accept that, accept those limitations, accept that it is very, very constrained, and roll with it and move on. But answer the phone. Always answer the phone.
Okay, how do we get the phone to ring, Marcus?
Yeah, I mean, you know, who are the people like us that are communicating, you know, these issues? You know, reach out to them if you have ideas. You know, we're always open to getting, you know, whatever, get this response to all of them. But we're constantly getting people out, emailing us these ideas. You know.
Don't send emails anymore.
Yeah.
Email is a waste of time. I delete my unread emails every 6 months, and at the moment I have 7,000 unread emails in my inbox at the moment. It is a completely devalued way of communicating with broadcasters because we get so much spam and rubbish in there. And I'm pretty fascist about who I block and so on. So I don't actually have that much, but there are
Have a good
7,000.
filter. If you know, if you see that, you know, you filter through them and you say, oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
You kind of-
I blocked you ages ago.
Yeah, I know.
So pick up the phone and build relationships, I think, is the main thing.
Yeah.
Jane, you happen to work on research in a very charismatic species. I think people have really developed a passion for bees. Does it take a charismatic species to get the media's attention or to get the public's attention? Are there other frames of biodiversity issues that might be equally effective?
I think that's a really good question. I mean, when I started working on bees, they weren't the kind of the darlings of the biodiversity media, and people kind of thought I was a bit crazy studying bees, and you know, yeah, I know you do, but the charismatic species, I guess, allow people to connect with something. And you know, coming back to what you said is, you know, if you can't communicate it in 90 seconds, you're not doing it right. Does that mean we need to kind of, you know, dumb it down? Does that mean we need to lose the complexity that actually is the whole point about biodiversity? And so I think that's something that's quite difficult to grapple with. I think the charismatic species can often act as a gateway. So I talk about honeybees as being the gateway insect, because everyone's familiar with honey, so they know about what honeybees do. They make honey. And then they find out there's 20,000 other species of bee on the planet that don't make honey. And it's like, oh, wow, okay. So the charismatic species can be a way into some more of the diversity, some more of the complexity. But I do think that there is an over-reliance on the charismatic species. And, you know, if my criticism of the media would be that it's all penguins and polar bears and pandas and bees. There's a lot more out there, and a lot of biodiversity is very small, it's silent, it goes unnoticed. But that, I think there's importance in the complexity, and I think we should be trying to communicate a message of complexity, and people, you know, can understand complex things.
What would you like to see them covering instead of bees and polar bears and penguins?
Well, I'm quite happy with the coverage of bees, obviously. But, I'd like to see more variety. I think that's, you know, the whole point of biodiversity is diversity, and so I'd like to see that variety in the media.
Right.
I would say that there's in defence. I would say that it's really tough sometimes with, you know, with nature in Ireland. You know, you're kind of like, it's not. You know, it's not Africa. You know, we don't have those, you know, South America. We don't have all those really exciting species everyone wants to see, you know.
We could have wolves.
Well, you know, yeah, you get into that debate.
The irony of this particular conversation is that somebody did a meta-analysis of all of the science papers published to find out, does scientific research have a bias towards vertebrate mammals with big, cute eyes? And it does. So we in media are only reflecting what you in academia are up to.
Big eyes. We are going to open this up for questions, so I think we have a microphone around. Does anyone want to stick their hand up? We have a question here. Woman, yellow cardigan. Great. And then if we could get a second mic to man in the middle there. Is that Ian? Ian Lumley, is it? I think, yeah. Thanks.
Hi. Is that working? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
My name is Lucy Taylor. I wanted to ask, because I guess here today we've been hearing a lot about how everyone needs to work together and all the interdisciplinarity and all of that in research and in a lot of this work to look after biodiversity. And I love programs that you two guys make and would listen and watch. But I wonder if that piece is relevant in media as well. Is there any effort to like insert nature into other types of programming? Like, I don't know, cooking shows where people eat foods that are safe to eat for biodiversity, or I don't know, just those other things. Does anyone speak to the people who write Fair City to, insert meadow making in there?
You're kind of seeing a little bit of it now. It's sort of creeping in, climate is creeping into things because it's sort of, it's topical. So you kind of see it a little bit, but it's on such a superficial level sometimes. It's just, where's the message? What's the real message you're getting out of it? You're kind of...
I think you're absolutely right. Your question is really, really well placed, because I suppose my failing that I'll have my hand up to here is that in the course of the last 3 years, I've been saying to my colleagues, as interviewers, you should always be thinking, what's the climate change question in this, no matter what the interview is, if it is, interviewing a Fair City actor. So what's the climate change question here? And I suppose the thing that I also need to be saying, and we all need to be thinking, is what's the biodiversity question in this? Because creating, like I suggested earlier on, the biodiversity doc and putting it in some backwater of the schedule does the agenda absolutely no favours whatsoever. The more that these issues are just woven seamlessly or interwoven seamlessly throughout the mainstream agenda, the better.
Would you say there's always a biodiversity question? Like, I think there's always a...
No, I mean, you can be absolutely ridiculous about this. Of course, there isn't always one in, Johnny Depp and Amber Heard. Apart from the shagging dog that they brought to Australia, I don't see the biodiversity question. So you can't take it to the nth degree.
I don't disagree. I think there's a biodiversity
Come on.
I think there's a biodiversity question everywhere. Your cooking program, your travel programs, the
Depp v. Heard now.
I know,
but the makeup that they're both wearing. I don't know.
I mean, there is. I think there is always an angle that biodiversity does underpin so much that there can always be an angle, and you need to find it.
No, you're right. And gauntlet thrown down, challenge accepted. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great. I think it's Ian there, is it?
I should really ask if there's anybody from Board BIA there. I wonder, because Antashka's been very loud in saying that Board BIA should be scrap, put out to grass, because it's a world leader in greenwashing on meat and dairy. But whether you were to ask, Philip in particular perhaps, how do we counteract greenwashing? Because we're absolutely being deluged with buckets of it. I'm covered in green slimy stuff. It's just utterly pervasive out there. And much of Irish media is very uncritical of this. And I'll give you a prime example. I always like to talk about prime examples. Danone, the French-based multinational milk powder conglomerate, which is now in partnership with Glanbia in the southeast of Ireland, has a plant in County Wexford that processes milk powder. These are very high energy plants. In this case, it's plugged into the gas system, so there's huge fossil fuel use in the plant, as well as, of course, the input of the milk supply for the plant. So it announced last year that it was the first Irish milk processing plant to go carbon neutral. And this got absolutely gushing, uncritical coverage all over the Irish media, including RTE, and then checking the facts and figures, it turned out that all they were doing was claiming carbon neutral on their processing plant only, and only because they were contributing to some offsetting scheme in Africa, and nothing about the feed and supply source of the extra milk coming into the plant and all the multiple effects, climate as well as biodiversity and water and ammonia air pollution that was having. So what I really, how can this uncritical greenwash that you unfortunate people in the media are being deluged with be counteracted with better critical analysis. Because what RTE did in this case, as well as other Irish media, was just a complete uncritical puff piece.
Okay. Doesn't pull his punches.
I knew that would. I knew that would get a round of applause. First thing that RTE will be most enthusiastic that I communicate right now is that I do not speak for RTE. RTE is quite happy to have me here, not speaking for them. Plausible deniability that the RTE is somehow in the room, but your man Boucher-Hayes doesn't have a clue what he's talking about, would be the attitude. So, in response directly to what you said, yes, there is an awful lot of stuff that has not been critically analysed, critically assessed, and has been accepted too often at face value in this area. I would treat it or think of it in the same way as we treat fake news. Talk to any different journalist, they will have different approaches to it. My one is where I see fake news, where I see greenwashing, where I see corporate puff pieces, I don't feel that it is my job to go chasing my tail, trying to play whack-a-mole with every single instance of this bullshit that emerges. I would never be able to promote the positive messages in the areas that I want to. I would never be able to platform the scientists whose work needs to have a light shone on it if I was playing that game of whack-a-mole all the time. So how do you challenge it? You challenge it by the provision of good quality information in the general area of this kind of programming. I made a program very recently in the area of gas networks Ireland, all the various providers of a variety of home heating products, and the amount of nonsense being spoken in this area was actually dizzying. And I started making a list of it, and I started dealing with each of them individually. Then I thought, no, there goes the whole program, just whacking down other people's bullshit. So what do? You make a program that says, here are the facts, folks. Here's how it actually is, as I can best determine it. Take those facts and arm yourself when you are consuming advertising or you are being marketed to or sold to.
Would you agree? Be more proactive, or?
Yeah, and I think it comes back to this issue of complexity. It is complex to understand things like carbon footprints and biodiversity footprints, impacts, but people can't unpick that unless they understand the issues. So yeah, we need to be clear about the issues so that people can become critical. And yeah, it would be nice to see some more critique coming out there.
I mean, it's unfortunate, but media has got decimated over the last couple of decades. Economically, I mean, there's so much revenue that's now moved online. And online, just you can say what you want, as well. So I mean, the mainstream media, that there's their responsibility to counteract all this. It's a big ask for them. I don't consider myself a journalist really, but I know a lot of people in the industry, and they're just getting by, trying to get their stories out, and to ask them then as well, debunk all the fake news that you see out there. I mean, a lot of the time, some of them just aren't informed well enough to spot that and catch it in time, and just don't have the time to get to it, like Philip said, So there's so much of it, and it'll always find a way out there, I mean, now with social media, you'd pay for ads and all that kind of stuff, and they are doing that, You're gonna continue to see lots of this, unfortunately, there isn't a clear answer on how, as a society, we should do it. All of us as individuals can do our bit on social media, online, do our bit and you see a lot of that kind of activism happening, and that when it happens, it's good, It's not just everyone's part of the media now, with social media. So I'd say play your part in that way.
I see a hand here. If we could get a microphone, and then I can take one more question in the back too. Thanks.
Hi. Apart from you four, who would you invite onto the communication and engagement panel who are going to write the communication and engagement strategy that is now going to be inserted into the Biodiversity Action Plan?
Yeah. or invite people. I was actually going to put that up as one of the final questions to all of you. One of the goals of this conference is that there are recommendations put forward to inform the National Biodiversity Action Plan, and the first objective of the plan is a whole of society approach to biodiversity. So what is the recommendations to government, and should there be a panel formed to do this, or is this something that we can come up with amongst ourselves?
At the risk of being rude to our hosts, the first thing that I would say is that you need to see an awful lot more farmers at occasions like this. I listened to Michael Dvorin earlier on. I see my neighbour Michael Keegan has just walked in, and I saw one or two other hands up. But unless there are as many farmers in the room as there are ecologists and environmentalists, we're all wasting our time. Farmers are the agents of change in this area, and if you talk above their heads, or you talk about them without them being present, forget it, folks. Wasting your time. Absolutely wasting your time. Beyond that, if you want to... I have a few suggestions of individual names of people who should be on, something like that, but we can save that for another day.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think we need to be bringing the youth into this conversation, and they are consuming media in a different way. They're getting their information in a completely different way to the way that we are. And so that communications needs to happen all the way up, and we can't just leave it to, oh, well, they learn about it in school. Anything in school that isn't on the test, well, maybe that's just my teenagers, but, that doesn't, it needs to be throughout society, so there's this communication, this education, this engagement needs to happen at all levels, and we certainly need to bring the youth, the farmers. I mean, there's lots of groups that need to come in.
Farmers, youth, who's next?
Yeah, I mean, certainly you need to have media people there that understand how to get, sometimes you see these panels and nobody really knows how to get the story out,
Not by email.
Yeah, so certainly that sort of mix. I agree with both of those.
Any particular media types? Any particular media people who get this? Do you think?
I'm not going to name a name here directly. I'd have to think about it. No, I haven't thought about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Final question to the man in the back there.
Hi. Is that on? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Kieran Allen from EcoEye. I have just a specific idea for the media. So I was actually going to say it to you individually later, but I'll say it to the whole room. I'm standing here, and I'm really enjoying the conference, and I can't fathom the existence of two things at the same time in our society. One being this conference, and the second being bottom trawling.
Yeah.
How does that exist? Yeah. And how was the stay the motion that was put forward to the courts in September for the stay on the order that temporarily banned only a small number of large-scale trawlers, how was it overturned? And so I have an idea for a media piece. So I believe that if anyone actually saw a trawling take place, then you would have public outrage and you'd have a permanent banning. But it's in the other realm, the one that's not ours. It's in the sea, because we don't belong in the sea. And so I have an idea, and that is that you make a film or a short film or a piece or a cartoon which depicts a trawling on the land. Okay, so you have a large net plowing through a forest, maybe with some human villages, maybe with some animals, and the net destroys the entire forest, and from the outtakings of that are a small number, I don't know what percentage is the average for trawlers, but it's a small percentage of the actual catch is actually taken and the rest is thrown back or is bycatch. So I think that would be a great idea for a media piece that would be very shocking. It would get lots of people involved watching, eating popcorn, being very sensationalized and scared. Thank you.
If the answer to the biodiversity crisis was shocking pieces of television, then we would have solved it a long time ago. I don't disagree with it, and it's a good idea, but it doesn't sound entirely dissimilar to a scene that I shot in a documentary back in 2019 where we had footage underwater from 30 years previously, and then we went back underwater in exactly the same place and showed the consequences of not just bottom trawling, but warming seas thanks to climate change and agricultural runoff, and the area that had once been rich with all kinds of diverse aquatic life now was an absolutely barren wasteland. It shocked the shit out of me. It shocked the hell out of everybody who saw it. And then the vast majority of the audience went and hopped on Ryanair.com to book their holidays to Malaga or continue their shopping habits in the same way as ever. Don't make the mistake of looking to media to do all the heavy lifting here, because frankly, there is only so much that we can do to persuade. I think we end up having the conversation largely with the 20% in the hope that 80% will follow where the 20% lead. But, you know, we don't have the superpowers that you invest us with an awful lot of the time.
I mean, Kieran's idea is not unlike Seaspiracy. I don't know if you guys saw that one, but at the time when it came out on Netflix, everybody was talking about it for a couple of weeks because it was so shocking what's happening in our marine environment. Why are people not responding?
I still haven't managed to eat calamari since my octopus teacher friend.
That's a win. That's impact.
I mean, it would be a powerful scene, you know. I was just thinking of expensive scene, powerful scene, you know. And it's a scene in a wider story, you know. What's the story you're trying to tell exactly, you know, and how you tell it, you know. That's sort of how we think about documentaries, if it's a documentary sort of idea. And then who's going to fund it, you know. So it's all those things we have to get over. You know, let's have a chat. Let's meet for a coffee and talk about how we can make that into a documentary, you know, and pitch it. But there's all that process in terms of how you get that onto the screen. It's a long old process, and then, you know, where does it sit in the schedule, and how does it go out, and does it get followed by a conversation? I'd like to see much more of RTE doing these, if they do these documentaries, to follow on with conversations, you know, like on Claire Byrne or Primetime afterwards, to kind of really get the conversation going in society, you know. You know, I'd like to see much more of that happening.
Is that the issue, Jane, that we see these shocking things, we hear these shocking evidence that people like you give us, and we're not then empowered with something to do other than not eat calamari or something like that?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think that's, you know, we're back to those shocking negative messages again, which turn people off. And if that isn't reinforced by you know, well, what can we do about that? And I think that's one of the issues, is that we, you know, if it's all doom and gloom about biodiversity loss, it can turn people off and not give them an answer, not give them a solution and something to do. And I think that's, you know, something that we learned through the pollinator plan was, okay, we started with the fact that a third of Irish bee species were threatened with extinction. That's the doom and gloom. Okay, where can we take that? And then take that to actions, to positivity, positive messaging, and in terms of providing practical guidelines and advice that people can implement and follow. So, yeah, I think it's following up the shock and the doom and gloom with some positives and some practicalities.
I think what works about the pollinator plan is that you had a guidance document for if you were a golf course, if you were a church group, if you were a householder with a garden or a balcony. Like you tailored the solutions to people's different perspectives, which seemed to work really well and get lots of different forms of engagement. So on that note, I think we could continue this conversation forever, but unfortunately we have run out of time. So my thanks to my guests, Philip, Jane, Marcus, and thank you all for staying and for your great. Thank you.